Mathematics is the language in which God has written the universe. Without it, one wanders about in a dark labyrinth. With it, every star becomes a word, every curve a sentence, and every law of nature a paragraph in a grand, infinite book.
Hello everybody and welcome back to another episode of By the Numbers. Today I'm joined by a very special guest, Dr. Patrick Adams, who got his PhD at MIT's Sloan School of Management and is joining the Wharton School in Pennsylvania as faculty in July 2026. Patrick's research spans asset pricing, household finance, international finance, and macroeconomics. Before MIT, he worked as a senior research analyst in the Federal Reserve Bank of New York's Macroeconomic and Monetary Studies function, and he graduated from the University of Connecticut. I'll let him introduce himself to you guys.
Thanks for the great introduction, Wes, and thanks for the opportunity to talk with you and for reaching out in the first place. I think this is an excellent podcast. I love the idea of getting people excited about math and talking with different people about how they're using it in their careers, because that's basically how I got started with all of this. Really, as a high school student, I was not a great student. I came to academics a little bit late, and really math was my way to build a career for myself, basically, to start just taking textbooks, consuming as much as I can, figuring out how to use that then to learn about economics, about the economy, about financial markets. And ever since then, I've just been trying to do as much research as I can and all the topics you listed, especially on household finances, and using this explosion of data that's become available to us in the last 20 years or so to really understand the financial lives of all different kinds of Americans. But I think especially the often forgotten high-income people who maybe don't get as much of the attention, but are quite important to the economy. Working at some of the high-tech firms, businesses that are creating a lot of jobs, and really understanding the financial pictures of these people's lives and what implications that has for the overall economy, for asset prices, and public policy.
That's amazing. I love to hear that. And so you talked a bit about how you're interested in household income. I know you wrote a paper on the job market, and in that paper you used over 25 years of U.S. tax data to study how high-income households handle stock market crashes. And you touched on it a bit about how there was this explosion of data, but how did that breakthrough in access to large data change what questions you're able to ask and what research economists like you are able to do?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say in general in economics, going back pretty far in time, the field is a field of research and academic inquiry that's been very strongly theoretically motivated. So you have a lot of great, books, for example, like Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, that were some of the original kind of tomes of, writing and thinking about economics that really motivated a lot of, the initial core ideas of the field. And so I think for a lot of the intellectual history of the field, especially through the 20th century, people were very focused on ideas and theories. And I think it's only really been in the last 20 years or so when we've gotten, one, a breakthrough in the amount of computational power available to us, and then two, a breakthrough in the amount of data that's available to us, particularly from these administrative data sources, which I can talk about. I think that's allowed us to take a lot more of these theories to the lab, to the real world, to understand how, essentially the ideas we have of how people invest their money, of the risks they face, of the fears that they have, how that actually stacks up with what we see them doing in this rich data that we have. And so when I say administrative data, that really means data that were, often not collected for research purposes, but that we've been able to repurpose in a way or get access to in a way that allows us to bring those rich data collected, say, by tax authorities, by local unemployment insurance offices or other, state governments in the U.S., or even private companies, like really large wealth management companies that run brokerage accounts and retirement plans for millions of Americans. Partnerships with these private companies and with the government have been really instrumental, not just in the U.S., but in other countries too, especially countries like Norway that have really opened up the coffers of their government data to researchers answering a whole host of very interesting questions. It's allowed us to understand, I think, in a much richer sense, what risks households face and how this shapes the decisions they make in their savings and their job choice and their portfolios, their decision to enter into entrepreneurship. So it's really having these data that give us a much more detailed picture than some of the aggregate statistics like gross domestic product. It's allowed us to really sharply test a lot of the theories that economists have had and wanted to test, but for a long time throughout the 20th century, we're lacking the kind of data that would allow them to do that.
Yeah, that's really cool. So you talked about how the administrative data specifically has been instrumental in opening up what kind of research you can do. Can you give like some real world examples of what you or some of your peers have been able to do with that extra data?
Yeah, so I can give probably 4 examples that I think are really illustrative of the power of using these data, and ending with a bit of what I've done with it. So I think one of the most important data sources that we've gotten access to are these really large data sets on individual income. That's both from tax authorities like the IRS in the US and also from other large government agencies like the Social Security Administration that collect a lot of information on people's income. Again, just because of not because they want to do research on this, but because their responsibilities, either collecting information on earnings to be able to pay benefits later in life or to collect taxes from individuals, turned out to be very comprehensive by virtue of the large task that these agencies have to do. And also, covers a very, very long period of time before researchers were interested in these questions. So I think there's a few really interesting things we learn from uncovering these data sets, peeking inside and getting a very comprehensive view of Americans' finances, all from the very bottom of the distribution to the top. And the first is that wealth is very concentrated at the top of the distribution in the United States. That is, if you think of, say, the top 0.1% of American households, they actually hold somewhere around, depending on the estimates you look at, 15% of overall U.S. wealth, which is a remarkable amount of concentration. And that's almost half of the wealth of the entire top 1% of Americans. That's 3 million Americans control about a third of all wealth in the United States from stocks, housing, private businesses. And within that, about 3,000 households control about half of that. I think another thing that's interesting that we learn about these households from looking at the data is that many of them are actually working households. They're not, I think, what we would think of as the traditional top hat wearing, monocle wearing capitalists who go out to survey the factory that they've purchased. That's where workers are tirelessly, creating cars or some other manufactured goods in their behalf. But these are people working in the service industry. These are, in some cases, highly trained doctors and lawyers or small business owners who may have a successful car dealership or restaurant chain that's done very well. And these people, these everywhere millionaires, as economists like Owen Zidar at Princeton and Eric Zwick at the University of Chicago have called them, they actually represent a large share of that top wealth group. And their private business wealth, these closely held private businesses that they operate, are a big source of that wealth and the income that they get. I think the third thing we learn is that many of those business owners and all types of other high-income individuals face a lot of risk in their income. So they earn a lot in good years, but that falls a lot during bad times in the overall economy. Think like recessions like the U.S. saw in the early and late 2000s and the financial crisis, or even more recently, actually, when stock markets were crashing in 2022, a lot of these high-income households actually saw large declines in the amount that they were taking back from their jobs or from their private businesses. And then finally, the fourth thing, what I've learned in my dissertation through the course of that work is that when many of these households face these large income losses, they draw down on the asset holdings they have. If you look at what they spend their money on, it's a lot of things that are difficult to adjust. There'll be things like mortgage expenses, be things like childcare or children's school tuition that are going to be tough to cut back on if you suddenly lose a large share of their income. what we see them doing instead is they're drawing down on their liquid asset holdings, their bank accounts, but even their stocks, even though this is a time when historically stock prices tend to fall a lot, but typically recover within the span of a few years. So it's actually very costly to be invested heavily in stocks if you are one of these high income households that's very exposed to the business cycle.
Yeah, so you were talking a little bit about, in the beginning, you were talking about how higher income people in the United States are obviously overlooked a little bit, and you said they play an instrumental role to the economy. And with the growing, or not growing, but the sort of bigger socialist movement in the United States as of late, what would you say to the people that are kind of asking to like redistribute the wealth from the higher income people? Like, how would you explain to them that the higher income people are actually valuable to the economy?
Yes, I mean, this is one where maybe I should be a bit careful, because I think the way this research works, we're really trying to, I think, just put information out there without really drawing too much in the way of maybe policy conclusions about redistribution and things like that. But again, what we can say is entrepreneurship is really important for creating jobs in the U.S. Many of these high-income households do own these businesses that do employ not a tremendous amount of people each one, but collectively as a sector do make up a notable share of overall U.S. employment. So I think economists so far, I would say, have been a bit agnostic about exactly what are the sources of, what skills or rents maybe are these business owners extracting. We don't really know. They're very talented. Maybe that talent comes in ways that are by virtue of having been able to go to fancy schools that allow you to go to prestigious medical or law schools to set up a high earning practice later on in life. But I think what we can say, just as a descriptive fact, these households own a lot of wealth, both liquid wealth like stocks and bank deposits, but also illiquid wealth like their private businesses. And so I think if you really want to understand, for example, business investment and fluctuations in the stock market, it's really important to understand the risks that these households face and what drives them to buy and sell assets or invest in their businesses over time.
Yeah. All right. So I touched earlier a bit on your job market paper, but from what I know after a brief read through, it argues that stocks are riskier for long-term investors than conventional wisdom suggests because of income shocks forcing people to sell at bad times. Can you touch a bit more on that? Kind of explain more.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, what we do in the data, which is data drawn from the Census Bureau, and I should say a quick disclaimer here: all the views I'm stating about the work, my description of it, and the research and the conclusions we've drawn are purely my own views and not those of the Census Bureau. And all the work's gone through an extensive disclosure review process to ensure confidentiality of the individuals underlying the work. But essentially, in the data, what we can see in the tax data that I think is really unique compared to a lot of the administrative data work that people have done in the past in economics is that we have a pretty good view of both people's non-financial lives, that is the jobs that they work in, the private businesses they own, and their financial lives, that is like the assets that they hold in a brokerage account, in their bank account, and that are ultimately going to be what's, when that job or private business is no longer something that's operating, that's going to be what's sustaining them throughout their retirement and funding their spending, and maybe forming the basis of bequests that they're going to leave to their children or other heirs. So from those data, we can essentially study when these individuals face large shocks to their non-financial income from their job or their private business. How do they use their financial assets to adjust to that shock, if at all? You might think when you take a large shock to your income, say you lose $100,000 this year and for the foreseeable future going forward, maybe households can just cut their spending by about $100,000 without having to dip into their assets at that time. Now, in contrast, what we see in the data is that it's more like about anywhere from 60 to 80,000 of those dollars are going to be replaced or taken down from their financial asset holdings. In contrast to what we sort of get in our benchmark models that people have worked with in economics to study these kinds of long-term investment decisions, where it's really that spending that's the main way that households are adjusting to these big income shocks. So it's going to be really costly then if you're one of these households to have to draw down on your financial assets at these times, because they typically lose their jobs in recessions when stock prices tend to have fallen a lot, but historically tend to recover pretty quickly after these crashes. So if you are one of these investors, even if stock prices drop today and recover in the future, your own wealth will not if you have to actually sell your stock holdings at that time. So that's going to turn a temporary crash in the stock market into a permanent financial loss for you. So I think the conventional wisdom that people had is that if you're a long-term investor with a horizon, say, of 30 or more years, you can ride out these 3-year boom-bust cycles in the stock market pretty easily, as long as you just don't freak out at the bottom and sell your holdings. I think what we see in the data instead is that it's very difficult for many of these high-income households to do that, because many of them actually need to draw down on that money at the time to fund these big expenses that they have when their income may no longer be sufficient to cover that once they've lost their job or face some other kind of downturn in their industry.
Well, that's interesting. So basically, when the market goes through a shock, these people are kind of forced to sell their stock assets because they don't want to dip into their actual financial income. Right?
Exactly. Yeah. So they're selling their stocks at these times, and the expenses that they have, I should say, tend to be pretty large actually relative to the amount of accumulated liquid financial assets that they have. That is, these are stocks in a sort of taxable brokerage account, so not like your retirement accounts and things like that. But really, if you look at the liquid financial assets that they can sell easily without paying a tax penalty, they don't really have a tremendous amount of those saved up relative to the typical expenses that they would have in a year. And relative to their overall income that would typically cover those expenditures. So if you lose, say, half of that income, you're now looking at selling a pretty large share of those financial assets to cover your spending. That's going to be pretty costly in terms of the foregone returns that you'll miss as the market's recovering in the years ahead.
That's really interesting. Wow. So we've been talking a bit about current research, what you guys are doing now, but what do you think the future of macro finance research looks like as more granular data, such as like tax records, as you were talking about, becomes available to researchers, as this kind of explosion of data just explodes even more?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the main things is just going to be to continue characterizing the kinds of risks that households face, the kinds of savings decisions they make over really long horizons, and then how this ultimately matters for the overall economy, for how it affects stock price fluctuations, how it affects the size of recessions, and the fact that they occur at all. These high-income households, again, they're a large share of U.S. wealth. They're a large share of U.S. consumption. So their spending is a pretty disproportionate share of overall spending in the economy. So when these households fall on hard times and have to cut back on some of that spending, that's going to potentially trigger a really large spillover effect throughout the rest of the economy. As other households, who work in some of the businesses that produce the products or services that they want to buy, then find their own income drying up as a result of that demand falling. And so I think the future work in research and finance and macroeconomics is really going to continue to understand just more deeply the kinds of risks that these households face, and continuously taking the evidence that we find about how households adjust to those risks, and then confronting the kinds of economic models that we use to understand things like the right public policy responses to try and stabilize the economy in the face of these risks and these shocks. Just continuously using the better data that we've gotten and the improved computing power that we have to just build richer and richer models that do a better job of matching the financial realities of a lot of Americans and other countries and consumers in different parts of the world overall. I think already in the last 10 years, we've already seen a lot of this work, I think, have real impacts in terms of understanding, for example, how fiscal stimulus programs, like the stimulus checks that get sent out during COVID-19 crisis and other types of downturns in the economy, where those should be targeted for the most economic impact. I think we're making a lot of progress too on a lot of these questions about retirement savings. What kinds of risks do households face? And what's the most effective way for them to hedge those risks? This is something that we're, of course, working on in our ongoing research right now that I hope will make an impact ultimately in the way that some retirement products are structured for investors in America and other parts of the world.
Yeah. So how do you, when you go through times of, I guess, economic crisis, you were talking about public policy a little bit. How much intervention do you think should be given when you're in times of a crisis? Like how much is too much? You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's a good question. And, I think, this is an area where there's still a lot of active debate over some aspects of the public policy interventions in the last 10 years during the COVID crisis, for example, about, whether the fiscal stimulus checks sent out at that time may have been too large, may have contributed to some of this burst in inflation we saw in 2021 and through 2023, and to some extent there's still echoes of that right now in the some of the high inflation that we've seen in some recent data releases from the Bureau of Labor Statistics and other government agencies. So I think this is still an open question. I think it's something where, again, as we get better data, even retrospectively, I think one interesting thing is that as more revised data become available to government agencies that produce the official statistics on things like inflation, things like employment and GDP become available, 5 years after the fact, we're actually learning new things about past economic events and policymakers' perception of the economy and the impact of their own policy choices based on new data that's becoming available to government agencies today that's improving the statistics that are available to us. And so I know, for example, for the Federal Reserve right now, going through an important review of its monetary policy framework and the different kinds of inputs to the decisions they make, data and the collection of it from unconventional sources that haven't been used in the past is a really important focus of that review. And they've brought in some outstanding economists to contribute to that effort.
Yeah. So you were talking about how kind of too much intervention could lead to high inflation. My parents always joke about how, like, when they were growing up, they could always buy a bunch of stuff for, so much less money. But I've heard some people say that little inflation is actually healthy, and that concept kind of trips me up because all I hear is people complaining about inflation. So can you kind of explain that a little bit, like how inflation comes to be, and is it like a natural process of economic growth?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I would say, I think, to kind of anchor the idea sort of in the abstract, I think a lot of the way I think about inflation, at least as a sort of lapsed macroeconomist in some sense, that does a little bit more household finance research right now. But I think one way to think about inflation and changing prices in general is that it's really a coordination problem in some sense in the economy. A lot of the problem that inflation poses is that the sticker prices of goods will go up a lot, maybe as things like the amount of money that's in the economy or in consumers' pockets changes significantly over a given time period. But not every other part of the economy is adjusting in tandem with that change in sticker prices. For example, a lot of retirees on fixed income that may have bonds that are paying out, essentially, cash dollar amounts. We call them nominal payments or coupons that they're collecting from the interest on their bonds. That's not always adjusting in sync with inflation. We do have some, classes of treasury securities that are indexed to inflation. But lots of assets in the economy don't kind of move in lockstep with the overall level of prices. And what that means is that even if you have the same wealth in dollar terms, at the same time, once prices have shifted in terms of the goods and services that you can buy, and that is your real purchasing power, that's shifting a lot for all different kinds of people in the economy. It's really a windfall in some sense for people who owe money. Who now can, if they're working in a job that's, producing goods and services, can essentially pay back more of that debt, the face value of it, working the same number of hours, while the person collecting the interest from that debt and the principal payments is now taking that money and going and buying less with it in terms of the goods and services that you can get for the same dollar payments. So I think the way I think about inflation, it's really unexpected inflation that's a big problem in the economy, because that's a really big transfer of resources from all kinds of people who lose out when inflation is high because their own assets or their own wages are not indexed to the general level of prices, to people who are on essentially the other side of that equation. So it's a big transfer from people who say owe $100 to people who are owed $100. So I think when I think of inflation, it's really those redistributive effects of unexpected periods of inflation that are the most significant welfare costs that you would, as economists would call it, that affect one group of people in the economy and another. So I think it's really important for policymakers, as they've thought traditionally, to try and keep inflation relatively stable. That's probably the first order issue, just making inflation relatively stable, easy for people to incorporate into long-term financial planning. And then there's a second issue of, what's the right rate of inflation? Should it be 2%? Should it be 4%? There's probably another interesting set of issues there that, if time permitting, we would maybe get into, but that might all involve discussing all kinds of things like the fact that they can't lower interest rates below 0%. So it's really that unexpected inflation that I think, in the instability of inflation, that's the big public policy problem to deal with.
Yeah, I never thought about it from the perspective of people who owed money. That's a very interesting perspective. Wait, so you just said that you can't lower interest rates below 0%. Is that like a legal thing, or is that just a generally accepted principle because you're losing money, obviously?
Yeah, so that's absolutely so. It's a great question if it's a legal thing. I think this is one of those questions in the U.S. where we haven't yet had to dig that deep into the monetary toolkit and figure out, essentially bring the case to the courts potentially, or have the lawyers and some of the key financial regulators in the U.S. Delve into whether this would be possible or not. There's certainly other countries that have set negative interest rates for banks in particular to park their reserves at the central bank. So in the US, when banks like, say, JP Morgan essentially have their own savings account at the Federal Reserve, they get a small amount of interest on that. That's essentially the main policy tool now that the Federal Reserve has, is adjusting that rate that they pay on interest, or that they pay on reserves that banks hold at the Fed. In other countries, they charge the banks to hold their reserves at the central bank. Japan is the most notable example of this. They've had negative interest rates for a large share of the last 25 years, which has really been challenge in some sense for the country. I think the country's faced a number of challenges that have required monetary policymakers there at the Bank of Japan to find all kinds of creative ways to stimulate the economy. One way you can stimulate the economy is by telling banks, if you put your money in safe places, we're going to tax you for it. So go out and lend it to businesses, see if they can go start new ventures, hire new employees, and if we can restart the economy. Japan struggled a lot with it, which I think illustrates maybe some of the limits of these tools like setting interest rates to revive an economy that maybe has some deeper fiscal and demographic issues.
Yeah, that's interesting. So we've been talking a lot about, your current position where you're a PhD and you're going to be starting faculty at Wharton soon. But earlier you talked about how you weren't always as interested in school and learning and things like that. So walk us through your path a little bit, undergrad at UConn to the New York Federal Reserve Bank, now a PhD, right? Obviously very successful. How did you kind of, fall in love, to say, with economics and math in general?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, my academic journey has been a little bit of a roller coaster. I think I initially peaked around fifth grade or so. I was a very good student in elementary school. And, as a growing young boy, I think took a lot of other interests. Guitar was one of them. So really my dream for the first half of my time in high school was to be a jazz musician. And I attended a performing arts high school for those first 3 years of high school. I was spending a lot of time practicing, not a whole lot of time, say, reading books or learning math, and my grades kind of reflected that at the time. Later on in high school, I kind of realized it's pretty tough to make ends meet as a jazz musician. And also there's this whole rich world outside of music, as interesting as it is, to try and understand all that everyone's doing in the world and the economy and the country, what's going on with policy. So this was a time a few years after the financial crisis when I was hearing a lot about Lehman Brothers and the Federal Reserve and quantitative easing, and just wanting to understand these terms that I was hearing in the newspaper. And essentially I just crept in, starting out reading economics books. It was really, stuff way out of, not the traditional economic mainstream now. It was like Austrian economists, sort of a very free market kind of, field of economics that eschews math and that kind of formalism. And then realizing, okay, if you want to study economics seriously at the graduate level, you really need to learn a lot of math. And so, about halfway through high school is when I kind of realized, okay, maybe I should start learning math, taking that seriously again. And so I just started out, trying to absorb as much as I could from my classes, from textbooks on the side, eventually sneaking my way into a calculus class that I was not on track to complete by the end of high school. And that really opened up a lot of doors in college. I didn't necessarily have the kinds of amazing opportunities to go to some, really prestigious colleges that, a lot of people I now work with had the chance to. But I worked very hard when I was there. In particular, I realized that you could just go and take courses in the PhD programs in math and economics. If you're an undergraduate who comes in with the right amount of training and preparation from outside the classroom. And so that was really an important outlet for me to absorb a lot of math and a lot of technical tools that served me really well working at the Federal Reserve after college. So I worked for 2 years, as you had mentioned, at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York doing macroeconomic forecasting and monetary policy research. It served me really well in grad school. I was very well prepared for the coursework component of grad school, where for 2 years you are, again, primarily learning the core material in the field out of a textbook or out of research papers. I think the much more difficult thing that is really tough to prepare oneself for is when you are now the one who's supposed to be producing the academic research papers. They don't have great preparation for that, and I think it's only really, through a lot of trial and error and learning how to, I think, sit with this difficult process and keep coming back to it day after day, despite challenges, despite things not working out for some projects you want to take on. I think that perseverance is something that's very difficult to learn out of a textbook, and the only way to do it is really to practice it by just going out there and trying your own research projects. So that I would say is the biggest thing that's difficult to learn outside of the textbooks. That for any graduate student is one of the main parts of the training.
Yeah, how long did it take you to get your from when you first started writing academia and articles and stuff like that? How long did it take you to get your first paper published? If you know. So that first paper that I published, it's called Forecasting Macroeconomic Risks. It really came out of the work that I was doing at the Federal Reserve. So essentially, we were working on these tools to create forecasts for what we call growth at risk. So if we think of a lot of economic forecasts, they're giving you their best guess of what, for example, the country's GDP growth is going to be over the next year, which can be really useful. If you're, for example, want to know, what's the most likely path for the economy and maybe plan out taxes or monetary policy accordingly. It's not always the most informative statistic, in particular at times when there's a lot of uncertainty in the economy and volatility in financial markets. And so these growth at risk methods that I worked with a really outstanding team of economists to help develop and kick the tires on, focus on answering a different question. What's in some sense your worst case projection for what GDP growth could look like 1 year down the road, for how the economy could be doing, for how high the unemployment rate might rise? And oftentimes, if you're a policymaker that's worried about risk and potentially giving the economy some kind of insurance or some kind of precautionary protections against those kinds of bad
tail risk disaster scenarios happening, that's often the statistic you want to look at, in particular when there's a lot of signs of fear in financial markets that seem to be indicating that investors think something bad may be on the horizon. So we started working on that project around 2018 and had the good fortune of having it published in 2021. So that's a 3-year time period, not always working on that paper, but it goes to illustrate, the publication process moves pretty slowly in this field. To stay abreast of all the changes that really matter in the research front, especially with AI right now and its impacts on the labor market, it's really the unpublished papers that are the most informative ones to look at. And so a lot of the profession focuses, I think, on a public discussion of those not yet published papers rather than working off of the slightly, sometimes quite delayed work that gets published in the journals today that really was written in many cases 5 or 6 years ago.
Yeah. So obviously, you're a very knowledgeable person in this subject, and I'm not going to ask you any personal questions about your stock portfolio or anything, but if a young kid came up to you my age, or maybe like a young adult in college or something that came up to you and said, what's a piece of advice I'm looking to start getting into investing in stocks. What's one piece of advice you could give me? What would you say to them?
Yeah, so the number one thing I think I would say, based on the work I've done so far, with a big caveat that I'm not a personal financial advisor and this is not financial advice. Having an emergency fund is incredibly important. And that should be really the big personal finance first building block that a lot of people take care of. Once, you should worry, I think, about having enough money in really safe liquid sources like a bank, checking, or savings account to cover a large share of the typical expenses that you wouldn't be able to cut back on in a typical year. Things like rent. Obviously, you as a high school student may not be at this point yet, but any of the expenses people have that are associated with their families and their children, that's a really large share of what they typically spend their money on. And it's really crucial, I think, when you're thinking about your long-term financial security, to make sure that you have a big enough buffer that you'd be able to cover a lot of those expenses during a rainy day. And so I think really that emergency fund is the first piece of financial advice I would give to anyone, to focus on building that up to the point where you can cover at least a few months worth of expenses, and ideally as much as like a year, I would say. You can start thinking about investing in stocks and things like that, but I think really the ideal place for people to be investing a lot of their stocks is in some of their long-term accounts, their retirement accounts, 401ks, IRA accounts. Those are really the accounts that we don't intend to dip into in the relatively short run. Typically you're thinking with a horizon of 30 or 40 years when you'll retire as when you'll be drawing down on that money. So it's sort of the ideal place to put assets that might be very volatile and swing up and down in value in the course of a few years, but in the long run have done quite well financially. That's a little bit different than how people think about gaming taxes in terms of which accounts you want to put which assets in, given that these stocks have sort of a preferential tax treatment compared to bonds. But this is something that I think is a first order consideration for people, is where should your assets be located given when you think you will need the money, and what those assets will look like and how much their price may have fallen when you need to tap into them.
It's a great answer. Thank you. So, we're getting close to time here. There's one more question I have to ask you. I don't know if I put this in the file or not, but I do this thing where I ask each guest, what's one question you want to ask to the next guest on the show? And your question was, what would you say to a kid that's looking to pursue a career in math? Or
in math? Yeah, math in particular. So if it was a kid specifically that I was giving this advice to, I think it's crucial now as the AI tools become much, much more powerful. And I should say I'm a huge user of these tools in my everyday work. And it's been a bit of a challenge to figure out, what tasks can you safely give to your agent, and which ones, do you maybe need to think more carefully about reviewing the work that they've done, or really just, confining the agent to some kind of exploratory work that's going to make it easier for you to check your own work later on or implement something more quickly on your own. So I think it's crucial to first learn how to use these tools in that way, learn what they're good for, what they're not good for, what, the sort of spectrum of tasks where you need to review what they do very carefully versus other things where you can kind of let it run free when the stakes are lower. But I think for a kid especially, or someone, say, still in their college education or just having finished college, it's crucial to learn how to use these tools in your learning as something that will improve your understanding rather than degrading it and letting your own critical thinking skills atrophy. I think this is a huge risk right now, and it's going to contribute, I think, to very divergent paths of different people who get access to this technology right now, especially at these formative stages early on in their education. I think it's very easy for you to, essentially, cut the platform out from under you in terms of developing these kinds of critical thinking skills if you're always taking every problem that's posed to you directly to the LLMs. On the other hand, if you are having a large language model or agent actively pose problems for you and then review the answers that you give to that, it can be an incredible asset for your own learning. And so I've also learned how to use these tools now so that I can quickly learn new subjects much faster than I would have previously when I was just figuring this out alone in my office or at home. I think it's taken the place for a lot of people of really good, insightful colleagues who, not replacing them, but essentially always giving you someone on demand who you can bounce your ideas off of. And it's crucial to make sure that I think it's your ideas that you're bouncing off and not the machine's ideas that you are uncritically accepting. So that's the biggest thing right now for young people at this formative stage, is to learn how to use this as a tool and an amplifier of your own thinking rather than a crutch.
I like that. That's a really great answer. All right, so that was your question. I guess I'm kind of putting you on the spot here, but if you could ask one question to the next person that comes on to the show, if you want to take some time to think about it, that's fine. But what would your question be?
Now I can more or less fire a similar question right back, which is, so how has artificial intelligence and all the tools that have become available to us affected the way you work every day, if at all? And how do you think that's going to change in the next 5 years?
All right. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Adams. And to all of you watching at home, make sure to subscribe to The Statistical Significant, and to finish this episode, hit the subscribe button. Thank you so much.